we go. Hello? All right. That's you?
Yep.
Okay, we're good. This is not Daryl. This is Rod Diller. And maybe. Well, good morning. Talk about ambitious. We're going to cover the book of Exodus today. So I hope you've enjoyed your reading. We had a lot. I mean, it goes fast, right? Narrative goes fast. So for the sake of organization today, first of all, very excited about the baptism this morning. I always wonder in baptisms, and this is just my own oddness, did we get him all the way under the water? And I was so convinced that he was all the way under because when I got my stand, it was significantly wet. So, I mean, there was so much water displaced back there that it'll take a week to clean. You did a great job. So we're excited about that. That is so fun. That is a great moment. You don't get to walk your son down the aisle, but you got to do this. So.
Yet.
I'm sorry? I guess I could, but it'd be a little strange. I don't know. So we're going to break Exodus into two pieces. And we're going to cover the first piece here for the first half of class, and that's going to be basically from Egypt to Sinai. And then we're going to talk about the second half, which is kind of all the law, the tabernacle, those kinds of things. And I remember thinking as I was reading through it, kind of felt like a Lord of the Rings adventure. My son-in-law said it's really best called There and Back Again. If you're a Tolkien geek, you get the humor in that. So much going on. There are a couple of ways that you may have read this story. So, you may have read the Exodus out of Egypt with your Jesus hat on. Do you know what I mean by that? You're looking at being saved. You're looking at being taken through the Red Sea. You're looking at being bought out of slavery. You're looking at a transformation of becoming not God's people to becoming God's people. You may be looking at Exodus as the foreshadowing of what God's going to finally do in the kingdom. And you may have seen over and over again all of these little nuggets that kind of backward point, as we know what we know now, points backwards to this story. And that's a valid way to read it. And there is so much foreshadowing and so much prophecy that happens in the Exodus story because, let's be clear, the Exodus story really is the great story of God being a God who saves, God being a God who redeems, God being a God who rescues. That is the story. But there's also something really powerful about reading this story and trying to kind of let Jesus be Jesus when he shows up. Because they don't know. Our characters in this story don't know what we know. They don't know about the temple in Jerusalem yet. There's lots of things they don't know that we know, right? So let me ask this question as we're kind of getting in. What is an advantage of trying to read as one of the Israelites going through this journey versus reading as somebody who knows the end of the story? Yeah. Doesn't it make it a little more real? Doesn't it make the suffering a little bit more suffering? The wandering in the desert a little bit longer? When we don't know how the story is going to end? We just read the book of Job that's all about suffering. And now we're reading about a people that are coming out of 400 years. Let's not just skip over that. 400 years in slavery. Put there by who? By God. That sounds a little Job-like, doesn't it? So let's not miss the immensity of the journey that these actual struggling to believe people are on and just go, look at this great metaphor. It wasn't a metaphor for them. And in fact, we know that all of these people who come out of Egypt, there's only going to be a few of them that go on. For most of them, they end up more like Job's family than Job. So, what were some of the things, I want to get you guys involved, what are some of the things that you saw, maybe for the first time, as you read through this? What were maybe some of the things that you had seen before, starting with, and remember, we're starting basically leaving Egypt here with the plagues and all that kind of stuff. What were some of the things that you saw that you wrote that down in your book and you're going, man, I hadn't really picked up on this before?
I may note that the Lord never left Israel even in their suffering.
Okay.
I know that, but it's God doesn't promise easy; He promises faithfulness. That's what He promises. To be faithful, He'll be with you. So.
What stuck out to me the last few times I've read Leaving Egypt is when God is talking to Moses and it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart, or I will harden Pharaoh's heart, which I still am not all the way sure what to do with, because it seems like a lot of heartache could have been avoided, not only for the Egyptians but also for the Israelites, because their workload gets increased because of all of these plagues, and the Israelites who don't put the blood on the door, they lose their children and things like that. But God is the one who's like, I'm going to make this really hard for you guys to leave, is kind of how that reads. And I'm still not all the way sure what to do with that.
So she makes an interesting point, which is, and I think the key phrase that I heard from you is a lot of heartache could have been avoided. I would say the exact same thing, so I'm not picking on you. But isn't that what we often say to God? God, couldn't a lot of this heartache been avoided? We just read Job. Couldn't a lot of that heartache been avoided? Is heartache going to be avoided? Can we all say amen? If you're going to follow the Lord, is heartache going to be avoided? No. Jesus says it's going to be hard. So let's get into this a little bit. First of all, you can jump in at any point.
I had some of the same thoughts as Alex did. One of the first things I wrote down in reading this is the whole book. The phrase "murmur" kept coming up over and over. It's kind of a theme. So I just was like, okay, I think I know what murmuring is. But definition, according to Webster, is a subdued or private expression of discontent or dissatisfaction. So Exodus 1 starts, and what do we see? The Hebrews were oppressed, but the more they were oppressed, the more they flourished, right? Interesting. And then to Alex's point on why this have to be so hard, couldn't there have been so much heartache that could be avoided? Well, even with all of that heartache that the Israelites went through in leaving Egypt, once they left Egypt, what are they doing? Still complaining, right? Oh, remember the good old days in Egypt? We knew what we were going to eat. We went to the well and we got water. So I think this is the first time I really thought about that pain and that suffering that they went through, that God didn't just have to lead them out of Egypt. He almost had to make them so miserable that they wanted to leave Egypt, that they that they would say, yes, I want this relationship with you. There's more than this, somewhat miserable existence that I can find in God.
The other thing that strikes me is how much detail God gives Moses before this happens. Moses, there's going to be a bunch of plagues. I'm going to harden his heart. He's going to say yes, and then he's going to say no. I mean, detail.
Twice.
Yeah. Unbelievable detail as to exactly how this is going to play out. Alex used to do this thing as a kid. She played this game as an extrovert. So what's going to happen next? And then what's he going to say? And then what's she going to say? And then she wanted to know everything that everybody was going to say in this make-believe thing that we were doing. She wanted to know everybody's line. God gives everybody's line before it even happens. And I think, again, reading this as a participant versus reading this as somebody who's looking back after it's all over, let me ask the question, are we still on a journey similar to Israel? Yes. We have a book that tells us how the story's going to end. But do we feel like at times maybe God isn't really in charge of all the details? Or maybe the suffering could be avoided? Couldn't this be easier? Why does it have to be so hard? So remember, we share this journey with them. This isn't a book that just tells us how this thing happened at one point in time when God was running the world, and now we're just kind of left to figure it out on our own. We are still in this story. So I'm going to say that one of the reasons that I think that God goes with all of the plagues, I've got a couple of them. One is that he needed to break the Israelites, and he wasn't entirely successful at it, but he needed to break the Israelites' 400-year experience with pagan gods. Each one of those plagues represents God being more powerful than one of the core Egyptian gods. The Nile, the cows, everything, the sun, the firstborn, all of that. All of the things that they worshiped, God showed he was more powerful than. Number one. But also, it was this thing where God wanted this event to be so big that all of the nations of the world would hear about it. This wasn't, I'm just going to sneak you out the door and no one will ever know why or how it happened. God made Egypt. When did God make Egypt so powerful? Joseph with the 7 years. That's where they got their bankroll. And so now God is saying, I made you really powerful, and I've done this for a reason, because the world is going to know who is in charge of this people that's walking through the desert. So it doesn't just work if we turn the water to blood, and then he goes, hey, that's enough, I'm out. There'd be lots of explanations for that. So I think God is thinking long term, obviously. But I think there's a whole process of God saying, I need to make this a big deal, and I need everybody talking about it.
It says that in 10:2. It says that you may tell your children and grandchildren how I dealt harshly with them. There's his lordship at play here, and that's, I think for me, is I get wrapped up in what is God doing for me today, as opposed to, and that's, no king has ever asked that of his subjects. He doesn't go around and say, is there anything I can do for you? That's not how kings and lords work. It's very much the opposite. It's, your job as a servant of the Lord, of a Lord, is to make that Lord powerful and strong.
John, to your point, I thought it was interesting. Excuse me, when it says that a king arose who did not know. So the next Pharaoh did not know Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of, just me imagining, the other side of that is there was a whole group of Israelites who did not know their ancestors.
Correct.
So it's really kind of a little telling thing there that there's a lot going on. So to your point, they've probably become somewhat involved in some of this polytheistic thought. And I think that's borne out when Moses sings his song and says that you are the God among gods. Why would he say you're the God among gods? So obviously there's some polytheistic. To that end, I think one of the big stories here is the conflict that Moses has with himself and identifying, who am I? Who really am I? Because there's so many tells there with him that he doesn't know if he's an Egyptian. He doesn't know, he doesn't know if he's an Israelite, and the Israelites don't know if he's an Egyptian. And when he goes to Midian, they think he's an Egyptian. It's really interesting. Moses trying to figure out who his identity is, and God trying to help him see what that is.
Becky?
I think one of the pieces that I probably hadn't really realized before is that a lot of Egypt scholars think that Ramesses II was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. It was either him or his son. And Egypt reached the pinnacle of its power during Ramesses II's reign. And then something happened, and they began to decline. Egypt doesn't have records of that because they did not record their defeats, but something happened, and Egypt began to decline there. And a lot of people think it was probably the Exodus and the result of everything that happened with that. But I think also that when the children of Israel escaped, they were, of course, yay, we have our freedom, but how do we do this? Because they lived in a very controlled society, things had been provided for them, and I kind of wondered, when they were murmuring in the desert and they wanted to go back to the leeks and the garlic and all that, and they were asking for water, was the whole concept there that they were thirsty, or were they asking, where is our version of the Nile that brings us everything? Everything in Egypt centered around the Nile, the planting, everything. So when they escaped from Egypt, were they saying, okay, thanks, God. Now, how are you going to set us up to do that? And he gets angry with them, and I don't think it's being angry for being thirsty. I think it's angry because they're not trusting him to replace everything that they knew. If you work backwards through the timeline, if Ramesses II was, or his son was, the Pharaoh during the Exodus, that means that King Tut was alive during the time that the children of Israel were there. So they had seen great power and wealth and all of these things from the Pharaoh top down. And now, where's ours? We don't even have water. We at least need a Nile to start with. And I understand they're murmuring a little bit better when I think of it from that perspective, but also God's reaction to it. We're doing something totally different here.
Yeah, I understand that, and it's that vision issue, the difference between God's vision for what He wants your life to be and what so often we want our life to be, the physical comforts. When talking about their time in the wilderness and their wanting some of those. Just this happens at this time, and then we get our draw our water from the Nile or whatever. Some of that just kind of routine. I thought personally about my own experience how, except for the first year and a half after I graduated from college, I've been in 100% commission sales ever since. And now they're going out in the wilderness, and I can feel that change in thinking about, like, if you've only worked for the federal government all your life, and you know a paycheck is going to be there every week, and you know that you go into work at 8, and then you take an hour lunch break, and then you come home at 5, your life is very scheduled, and it's also, I can tell you, you should do full commission sales sometimes because you will see God's hand at work in your life, and when things that you don't know how they're going to happen or how it happened or how you paid a bill. You have opportunities of growth and for faith in God that you don't have when your Egyptian master is just providing your most basic existence. And I think it wasn't just the people. Look at Moses when he comes upon the burning bush. So here it is, this amazing burning bush that's not being consumed, right? Kind of supernatural, right? God first says who he is. Here's my credentials, here's my resume, right? And then this is what's going to happen. And then all of Moses' questions are all about like physical limitations. And it's like, dude, you're talking to a burning bush that's not being consumed. Even in the presence of God, sometimes we can't have it's hard to have those kingdom eyes, and Moses had the same struggle, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I was struck by right after the burning bush and this debate going back and forth, who am I? And God telling him, convincing him to go, and then he goes, and then in verse 24 or something, God shows up at camp and says, "Hey, I'm going to kill you." And the Gentile woman, somehow or another, saves him. But it doesn't give a lot of explanation there. You can read people's opinions about it or whatever, but it's like, okay, so what in God's mind had he already been weaving in as a backup to Moses? Because right here it says he's going to kill him. So to me that was kind of like, wow, what happens to the rest of the story? How does he weave that back in if he does kill him? If she didn't.
Well, just a few chapters later, he's saying, well, fine, I'll just kill all the Egyptians and just start over with you, Moses. So God is let's just say it this way, God is really invested in this. Have you ever been really invested in something and somebody messes it up and you're ready to kill him? God is really invested in this. And he needs his people to participate and just show up. I think it goes back to what John's saying here is that Moses isn't really sure who he is. And his wife's not an Israelite. And so what's their son? How are they raising their son? Is he an Israelite? Is he a Midian? Who knows? We know later that Moses doesn't really involve his family. We don't hear a lot about Moses involving his family. We don't hear about Moses' sons coming up and taking over the leadership. I mean, there's Moses, and then in the background there's his family. So, I don't know if Moses' son was uncircumcised because Zipporah wasn't really for it and said, no, he's a Midian. I don't know if they had that argument going on. In this moment, she decides that this is probably a good time to give that one up.
How did she know to circumcise him?
I think they've had this discussion.
I do too. I think they circumcised the first one, but not the second one.
That's entirely possible.
I think she was repulsed by the whole idea of circumcision. And they're going along, and the second one, they haven't circumcised it because, Zipporah's like, this is repulsive, we're not doing this. And he's trying to keep peace in the family. That's just all speculation on my part. I don't know, it's interesting. Moses has really got confident.
Yeah, he does.
And all of that kind of goes back to they didn't really know who they were, and they didn't know whose they were, and they didn't know who the one true God was. And when the Egyptians were killed after the crossing of the Red Sea, and the Israelites said, well, we believe in God now, and we believe in his servant Moses. And then it's only a few chapters later, they're building the golden calf. Because they had 400 years to build polytheism into their whole belief system. And just leaving Egypt didn't fix that. And we have a tendency to refer to these people as God's people. The one singular God, the true God's people. But throughout history, all the way to Jesus, they were continually struggling with polytheism.
Not until the Assyrian captivity does it finally end. So Job comes out of his loss knowing God in a way that he didn't know him in plenty. The Israelites spend 40 years in the desert because they don't know their identity. What might we gain from looking at times of challenge and trouble and wandering and suffering?
John, to me, it's similar to them. We look at today and maybe tomorrow, right? And maybe the day after, especially when we're hurting, right? And short-sighted, we look at them and go, good grief, how short-sighted can you be, you know? And by the way, I'm I guess what you'd call a student of the plagues. Typically when we talk about the plagues, we say, flies, gnats, blood, we name them. But when you read the details, it is astounding. Each one of them by themselves. But I think there's so many lessons of short-sighted and remembering God is in charge, and his plan is not ours. That's what I get from this. They're like, wait a minute, there's this sea in front of us, we're about to die. Mm-hmm. Well, that's their plan, right? And then, okay, we're out here without any water, guess we're gonna die of thirst. And then the analogies to me are, I think we're similar in our world. We like Rod said, how am I going to pay my bills? I have no money. It's kind of like I'm going to die of thirst. Well, you're probably not going to starve to death, literally starve to death, right? In the U.S. And so, to me, it's the short-sighted, it's the hurting, it's today, maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, without seeing God's plan and forgetting, especially we forget, God's plan is not even for us to be here. His plan is for us to be in heaven with him. And that is so hard, especially when you're hurting or suffering or having troubles or can't pay the bills.
Getting away wondering what's so good about the good old days.
We survived them. That's what's good about it.
We tend to forget all the trouble. We just remember the good stuff. I guess that's good.
Like you said, God made it so difficult and so hard for the Israelites, maybe in a way to make them want to leave. And it's the same way now, a lot of suffering, a lot of stuff that's here in this world, it makes us long for heaven.
It should.
It should make us long for heaven.
And that's my point, is
Instead
that
of trying to figure out what we can do to make this better here, it's just,
it's to remember whose we are. It is to me one of the great lessons out of this, is that when life is hard, remember, when you feel like I can't fix this, remember who's in charge and whose you are.
Yeah, and Josh touched on the relationship that God, the lengths that he's gone to have a relationship with us a little bit in his communion thoughts. And, from the very beginning, how did God interact with Adam? And then as I'm reading this and I'm looking at how he's interacting with Moses, I think I always just gave Moses the role of, he's the mouthpiece of God, God says something, okay, this is what God said. But reading this, I saw more like God wanted a partner. And it wasn't just, I am God, you are my servant, go do this. He wanted a relationship with Moses. You see it even more when he's in I think it's Tent of Meetings, if I remember. Mm-hmm. I think that's the term that they called that, where Moses went to talk to God, and the pillar would descend on it. It basically says he talked to Moses like a friend. I think that's what God wants. It's pretty cool.
Or that crazy scene where Moses and the elders all sit down and have a meal with God.
Yeah.
Talk about a potluck. That's better than pie night. But only a little bit, because I really like pie night. So before we move into Sinai and the law, what were some of the key takeaways that you wrote down as to what God wants you to know about him? Or what God wants you to know? What's important to God?
I was just pointing out to Zach in my reading this week, when God comes to help, he really brings his fury. And I underlined with the water and the crossing of the Red Sea, no one survived. There were no people standing on or turning their horses around and running. When he came to help, he came to help. I mean, he wiped them all out. And I'm thinking, how many thousands of men were there? Chariots, horses, everything.
I came away realizing more clearly that God knows hearts. He knew Pharaoh's heart. He knew Moses' heart. I realized God, in a more crisp way than I have in the past, I realized God knows hearts.
Does that give you comfort?
Yes.
Most of the time? Some of the
Yes,
time?
most of the time. Scares me sometimes.
There are, go ahead.
We kind of give Pharaoh a hard time. I know we do. And give the Israelites a hard time, and I don't think we should give either one of them.
Tread lightly.
Yeah, I will. But I was thinking, just looking back over, God performed great works, but even in the face of proof, the hard-hearted are not going to believe. I think there's a lot of application now. I mean, there's, proof of God. How do you have a conversation with an atheist? I think it goes to the heart piece, right? God knows the hearts of people. You could show Pharaoh whatever you wanted to show him, it won't matter. We have conversations with friends and coworkers and fill in the blank, and sometimes it just doesn't matter. I mean, I can show you, proof of God, and it's not going to change some people.
I've heard that there are two core human needs. And the first one is to be loved. But the problem is that if you are loved but not really known, you know it's a fraud. Right? If they really knew. If they really knew all about me, then they wouldn't love me. So the second human need is interesting, and that is that you want to be known. But if we're known, we might not be loved. Right? You don't want to be a person walking around keeping secrets. You want to be comfortable in your own skin. You want to just have the freedom to be who you were made to be. And so I think it's that core question of, with God, if we are wrestling with God, we find over time that God not only fully knows us, but also fully loves us. And that is supposed to trickle into how we relate to each other at church. Is that I can fully know you because I know that God fully loves you, and he fully loves me even with all of my junk. And so not only does that give me permission, but it provides a mandate that we are free to be known and loved in this community. So they get to the mountain, and then a lot of details show up. What types of laws did you read that bothered you? Were there any laws that you read that bothered you? I'm just going right for it.
There's a few where it says, like, if one person either, like, has an idol in their tent or does something like that, you have to kill his entire family and then his entire household. And that
Yeah.
seems pretty rough.
That seems rough. Anyone else?
I was more closely shocked, or there was no, I was surprised at the similarities between our civil law today and the law that is presented here.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because I keep on going back to what you said earlier, is like, you know, not a whole lot of laws happening, you know, around this time. We need to create some sort of a system of consequences and, you know,
Measured.
yeah, so, you know, they didn't kill the whole village, you know, that, like they did with old boy, who raped his sister.
Mhm.
So that was better. It's just his feeling. So, but no, I think the, when I look at it, it's like, yes, there's consequences for actions, and some of them seem harsh, but, you know, beats wiping out a village, I guess.
So he makes a good point that a lot of the laws that are written down in this, starting with the Ten Commandments and then going to the laws that are written after that, are a lot of the laws, or at least the foundation of a lot of the fairness or the justice that we have in our system today, right? But they had slavery, right? And it seems like God's saying, well, since you have slavery, here's how you should make this all work. Anybody want to?
Slavery was only for a short time.
Mm-hmm.
It was meant to be for 6 years, and in that 7th year, to be released.
Right.
So it's more of a servant, not a slave.
Now, I don't want to make this something that it isn't, but I also don't want to make it I don't want to go the other way in making it something that it isn't. Slavery has been around for eons, and it still exists today, and I'm not a fan. And Israel was even involved in literally enslaving people that they took over, and not following through on the 6 years, right? And doing lots of stuff that was not inside of what God was ordaining. But there is an element, a small element of what's going on in Israel that we don't see today, which is the idea that if somebody couldn't pay their debts, if somebody got into trouble and they were looking at poverty, they had the option of indenturing themselves for a 6-year period of time to work that off and then get a fresh start. Please do not hear me saying that slavery in certain contexts is great. But this is an old culture. And history is what it is. And what you do see God doing is setting some guidelines and some rules around it for justice. You also see this same God who's doing that have some incredibly strong language about widows and orphans. So if you want to say that the God of the Old Testament was harsh and was backwards, what does God have to say about widows and orphans? And how do those laws of the Old Testament compare to how we as a culture and society deal with widows and orphans today? Do we as a society today take care of widows and orphans in alignment with the old law?
No.
Correct.
As a church, no, but as a society, a social work kind of thing that's done by government, they take care of the orphans.
Correct. There is an attempt to do that. Does God seem to get emotional in the text? I'm answering my own question. I read. Did you read that real quick?
I wrote that one down. Do not take advantage of the widow or the orphan. If you do, and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear it. My anger will be aroused, and I will kill you with the sword. Your wives will become widows, and your children will become fatherless.
Where does that say?
That is 22:22.
Does God care about widows and orphans?
Yes.
Does every law that God presents end with, and if you don't do this, I'm going to kill you and your offspring?
Unique.
This one has a certain emotional content to it. Correct? I think it's important. I am very thankful for our missions committee because it is one of the things that seems to be central to what they are bringing to the table for foreign missions for Oakdale. Do you want to, would this be an okay moment for you to talk a little bit about Ghana?
Just in the last couple of weeks, the missions committee has finished vetting an opportunity to serve in Ghana. And there's an opportunity down there, there's an organization down there called Village of Hope. And it started 25 years ago with a guy taking in some orphans in his home. And it grew to an orphan house, and then it grew beyond that to providing medical care for some orphans. And so then that grew into a hospital and Christian education at every level of the children. And there's a lot of children now being blessed by this organization called Village of Hope in Ghana. And some of our members here have actually gone down there and served and eyewitnessed what's going on down there. So we are, as a congregation, as of this month, taking on 5 orphans, and Oakdale will be supporting all the physical needs, all the financial support for 5 orphans down there, housing and clothing and house parents and medical care and education for 5 orphans down in Ghana.
Thank you. And I hope that as we do local outreach and local missions, that we never forget that God really does have a heart for the young and for those who are outside the system. Remember, being an orphan and a widow meant you were outside the system. It meant you were outside of the channel of the blessings of the culture. And I don't think it's a huge reach to say that as Christians, we should have our radar up for people who are outside of the channel of the resources of our culture. And that we should be looking for ways to help and looking for ways to help people re-engage and have some success. One of the things that was a huge wake-up call for me is this idea that one of the reasons that the Israelites are not supposed to make engraven images or or make things in the image of God is because we are made in the image of God. And that means that anybody that we come across who is having a hard time in their life, that is somebody who's made in the image of God. And we need to be thoughtful of that. Now, some people recoil at the idea of social justice, and social justice can get morphed into a lot of political platforms. This is the platform I'm talking about, is that God has a heart for people who are outside of the channel, and we as the church need to have that heart too.
I agree.
Do you have anything on the law section you want to get into?
I thought it was a whole lot easier to pull stuff out before Exodus 24 to talk, like specific things. All through Exodus 21 through 23 talked about, kind of the rights of the second-class citizens. People they thought at the time were second-class citizens. And then 24 through 30, a lot of tabernacle and priest instructions. And some of the imagery, that's a whole lot of information in there, a whole lot of detail, and a lot of things that just like you just read one sentence, it's like, okay, that seems mundane and unimportant. But if you've heard me teach class before or communion thoughts or whatever, I like patterns. I was the Christian looking at this and whole thing and seeing patterns and stuff. And I thought it was interesting that I never really thought about before, that the way that they were setting up the tabernacle, how it resembled the Garden of Eden, and how it all goes back to the Garden of Eden and God wanting a relationship with his creation. I thought that was pretty cool. It's the story. It's the same story over and over and over, and he's not just the God who rescues, but he's also the God that wants a relationship, wants to be in community with us. I didn't really realize. I think I gave people a pass, maybe before the Ten Commandments, that it's like, stuff wasn't written down. They didn't know what God wanted to do. But outside of number 4, the Sabbath, all of the other commandments were already mentioned previous. So I thought that was kind of interesting, that it was like this canonizing of these 10 things. And it's like, oh, okay, so those are important.
Yeah, so let's talk about the Sabbath, the new one. Is there something for us today? God makes the Sabbath for man. Is there something for us today that we should be thinking about and understanding about who God is when we think about the Sabbath? What's the purpose of the Sabbath? Is it to get a day off?
To stop what we're doing once a week and focus on Him.
Okay. Certainly we should be focusing on God more than one day a week. But there's a day that he says, I don't want you doing anything. And the problem comes when everybody goes, well, okay, wait a minute, really quickly, define what anything means. Isn't that, I've raised kids. Okay, exactly what are the boundaries here?
Don't even start a fire. Did you see that
What?
in there? Like, that was one of the things. Like,
Yeah.
Like, don't even start a fire.
Yeah, so nothing.
Nothing.
Sit down and be quiet. But Sabbath wasn't just one day a week. There were some other Sabbathy things going on. What were some of those other Sabbath things?
The festivals and the celebrations. 3 times a year, you're going to have the feast.
Right.
I think rituals are important to God. That's what I wrote down. Is like things for us to stop and remember. I think, I think about what we did today. Rituals that remind us that I'm giving my life to Jesus. Rituals that we sit here and eat and drink the cup. I mean, it's rituals that remind us that He died for us. That's the same thing here. I mean, God
Right.
puts these things in place. It's important to Him.
What about the whole farming thing? Every 6 years you farm, and on the 7th year you don't. Now, this is not the original idea of rotation of crops. You're not seeing here a model where, hey, you should divide all of your land into 7 pieces and rotate every 6 years so that your soil is producing the optimal yield. And by the way, here's how much fertilizer God wants you to put. No, this is not a farming recipe. In fact, it says, all of your land work at 6 years, and on the 7th year, don't. How many of you take the 7th year off work? I don't.
Was 2020 the 7th year?
That almost counts.
I never worked for this company, but it's Intel, and Intel encouraged people to take every 7 years time off. When it was an extended period of time, they encouraged you to take off.
Yeah, I'm just having a Jeff Peters moment. Sabbatical. How many of you would be comfortable financially taking the 7th year off? How many wives would be comfortable with their husbands taking a 7th year off? No. Did you not read any of this?
Well, what happened to those fields in the 7th year?
Well, they sat fallow. And yes. And the wild animals and all that.
Yeah.
So what would you have to learn to walk away from a year's worth of income? To save. What else?
Or you could just rely on God to provide.
Yeah. I mean, they're in the desert. Isn't that kind of the whole thing that they're trying to learn? I mean, we know that in Romans, the Jews are considered lazy because they don't work 7 days a week. They don't work 7 days a week. They take this Sabbath day off. The thing that comes out of Sabbath is you recognize where your bread is buttered. You recognize that it's God that's always taken care of you, that you're not doing it under your own power, and that your success is not your success, it's God's blessings. And whether you're successful or unsuccessful, God takes care of you. He has a way for you to get by, and He asks for the community to help take care of you. And if you can work, God expects you to work. But the idea is, I mean, every one of us, I think, kind of gets up on Monday morning, whatever your Monday morning is, and says, you know, it's time to make this work. And I've got to take care, I've got to put this all on my back and make it work.
There's a few instances also in this passage where God takes a very paternal role towards the Israelites. I think this is one of them, which is don't worry about it. I've got you. You need to trust me and take care of you. It's also echoed kind of in a much harsher way when he talks about Miriam. Miriam gets that curse put on her, and Moses goes, hey, can you fix my sister, please? And he says, and I don't know if I'll quote it directly, but he says, if you saw a dad spit on his daughter, would you interfere with that too? Which is so rude, but also, as someone who has had a dad who has dealt, you know, like he's not spit on me before, but who has given me pretty harsh consequences, even within those, I knew that I was still loved and I was still going to be taken care of. It wasn't like a, you messed up so you're out of the family type thing. And so even though that's a rather harsh story, it's also very comforting, which is there are going to be consequences when you don't follow through on things, but I've still got you.
We see in the story of the manna, they go out and try to collect on the Sabbath. It's a faith problem. God lets the manna stay overnight, keep overnight, when it doesn't on the other nights, but it does on the night before the Sabbath. They still go out and try to collect, and bad things happen. Later we see, Scott, do you remember which minor prophet it is? Yeah, I'm going to pick on you. Empty pockets, is that Micah? Pockets with holes in them, paneled houses. God basically says, you've given up on the Sabbath and you're working every day and you're trying to save money and make money and you want to live in all these paneled houses and I don't have a house. And so guess what? I've put holes in all of your pockets and in all of your purses and you get nothing because you've forgotten where your blessings come from. So I think that's a lesson we can still, as a commission guy, as if there's any agrarian farmers here, we all know that. We are not in charge of the weather. We are not in charge of the world. So I got to let you go because you got kids to get. Could you close us out? Or do you have a final comment that you want to?
Oh, I was just going to say that I think Exodus 19:6 sums it up. Says, you'll be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And I was like, what? I said that in Exodus? It felt like I was like, you know, reading Romans or something like that. So in that, if Israel is God's kingdom, God is the king, right? the ultimate king. And Israel's role as priests in a holy nation wasn't meant to be limited to worshiping God, but also a conduit to God for all of mankind, which eventually they accomplished through Christ. But we're that same conduit where we look harshly at them for kind of failing at their role of being conduit to all of mankind. Think about our role in that. That was kind of my closing thought.
Okay.
So
You want to close us out?
sure. Dear God, thank you so much for this day. Thank you for your church. Thank you for your amazing plan of salvation and community and relationship with us that you've had in place since the beginning of time. And we see you seeking after us over and over and over through history, and we see that you rescue us over and over and over. And with my earthly eyes, I think so many times I'd say, I'm done with you. I'm starting over some other way, but you continue to love your people. And thank you so much for loving us, and pray that we will relate and reflect on what has been laid before us in Exodus and so many other parts of the Bible that just says that you love us and you want us. And we pray that we love you and want you more every day this week. In Jesus' name, amen.
If you haven't been reading, jump back in. I promise you we're getting really close to Leviticus, which means we're almost done with Leviticus. And then we'll keep on trucking. So thank you.
I'm putting together a fishing trip. I was wanting to know if you guys wanted to go with me to the Sinai.